Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. We're on the Man of God Network, brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. And for listeners of the Covenant Podcast, we thank you for bearing with us. It has been a number of weeks since we have released an episode. Dewey and I have both been busy with responsibilities to our family and to our churches. We've also been, at least I have been, traveling for vacation and around the holidays. And whenever we get busy, this seems to be one of the things that we put on the back burner out of necessity. But we thank you for bearing with us. We're excited today to take up a topic that is of special interest to me. Having never read The Lord of the Rings, I'm somewhat embarrassed to mention the subject of what we're going to be talking about today. But as you've already seen in your podcast feeds, as you've clicked on the title of this episode, we're talking J.R.R. Tolkien with our friend Jeremy Johnston. And welcome back to the podcast, Jeremy.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, we've had you on in the past, and we're thankful that you're willing to have another conversation with us. We're having this conversation because H&E Publishing has recently announced that you have written a book on J.R.R. Tolkien. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
J.R.R. Tolkien, Christian maker of Middle-earth. And I'm assuming you're going to have to tell me what Middle-earth is. But to kick off our conversation, what prompted you to write a book on Tolkien, brother?
Well, I've been a long-standing fan of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. My brother, when I was a kid, he read The Hobbit and he kind of retold the story to me and got me hooked on it. And it was many, many years later when I started to realize that J.R.R. Tolkien is writing from a Christian worldview. And so I thought that's great. I'm enjoying reading Lord of the Rings. It's a book that I return to often. So every couple of years, I will reread The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It's on my regular cycle of repeats. But then along came, I'm sure you might know Dr. Michael Haykin, the esteemed church historian, and he's a good friend of mine. He talked to my publisher and said, you know what, we need a biography on Tolkien. And my name came up, and Chance Faulkner, H&E Publishing approached me and said, hey, would you like to write a biography on J.R.R. Tolkien? And I thought, that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Let's do it. I'll do it. And so here I am. They gave me a year, so I signed a contract. They gave me a year, and 3 years later, I finished the book because it was a lot more challenging than I thought. And I think this is because there's so much on Tolkien, and he wrote so much. I mean, obviously, we're quite, we know The Hobbit, we know Lord of the Rings. You might know the Silmarillion, but there are scads and scads of other material. Some stuff is still being published posthumously that he wrote. And then there's a ton of stuff written about him. So I was kind of drowning in a mountain of books and research, but it was a delightful 3 years to immerse myself in all things Tolkien.
Amen. Well, unlike Austin, I have watched Lord of the Rings, but I've not read the book. So I'm definitely not a Lord of the Rings connoisseur by any means, but I have watched the movies. It's kind of like in school growing up. You'd watch the movie, you'd read spark notes for the book. But in any case, Jeremy, it's a delight to have you here to talk about this latest publication. In the prologue, you write, I quote, "To ignore Tolkien's Christianity is to ignore Tolkien himself." And I think this is a fascinating statement to make. And I wonder if you could spend some time fleshing this out for our listeners by maybe sharing some information about Tolkien's conversion, maybe about how his spirituality affected his wider works as well. I think it's wonderful that a man this creative and a man this brilliant was, as you mentioned, writing from a Christian worldview, and there are Christian undertones in many of his works. So if you want to expand on that, we'd greatly appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. It's Tolkien's Christianity in the world of Tolkien scholarship, it is sometimes, and I would say often, overlooked, which is one of the reasons why I felt I needed to write this book. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. But I think people just don't understand what Tolkien was trying to do, and how his Christianity did inform his writing. And as you know, for any Christian who's truly a believer, Christianity is no mere addendum to your life. True faith will in fact inform everything we do. It'll inform what we value. It will inform, how we understand the world around us. Essentially, it's Christianity is how we see reality. And so for Tolkien, who I argue in the book was a Christian. Now, I should say, I'm not sure at one point I should say this, he was a practicing Roman Catholic. And I know that's pretty shocking to say a Roman Catholic and a Christian. But I would argue that although he did have misguided theology in a number of areas, and he was part of a, you could say basically a false church, that there are Christians within the Roman Catholic Church. There are Christians who are just who believe in Jesus, who have a genuine faith, and certainly that Christian value, Christian viewpoint did undergird his thinking and how he saw the world. And in terms of informing reality, seeing things clearly, it's kind of ironic that Tolkien, who's in some circles called the father of fantasy, the fantasy genre, as it were, he's the guy that we consider the most realistic in terms of his ability to write and capture the full human experience. And what I mean by the full human experience, I mean the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspect of reality. Something that I think if we get a chance, we'll talk about his idea of the true myth. But I often think of, I don't know if you're familiar with Francis Schaeffer, who talked about true truth. It's the same kind of idea that because of Tolkien's Christianity, because of his Christian worldview, he depicted reality as it actually is, which is why I think the Lord of the Rings resonates and has resonated with people for the last, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years. People continue from all walks of life continue to appreciate the Lord of the Rings. And I think because it's true to reality, it's true to their own human experience. Despite the fact that, as there are people in the world, there are non-Christians in the world, there are even Christians in the world who don't always have a clear understanding of what reality is. Maybe they're a bit deluded, but then they come to the Lord of the Rings. And although it's about elves and dragons and hobbits and those kinds of things, dwarves, there's still this beautiful portrait of the true deep human experience, the great issues of sin and evil in the world, the great need for redemption and salvation. These are major themes that Tolkien brings into his text, and it is unbelievably powerful. We can say that to truly understand creation, you need to understand or know the creator, and I think that this comes through very powerfully. That you can tell that Tolkien is a man who knew God, and he certainly in his letters, his personal letters, and in other areas, he talked about Christ. He talked about his relationship with God in the Bible. I mean, these are key parts of his life. And it clearly informs the kind of things that he wrote. Some biographers and some scholars have tried to focus on other things. Tolkien, I think we'll get to this shortly, but Tolkien was he was a professor at Oxford. He was an English professor at Oxford. He spent his career there. And he was an expert in philology. And philology is the study of language or the structure of language. And so some scholars say that the Lord of the Rings is based purely in language, which it is. Tolkien actually invented 3 entire complex languages to undergird his mythology in creating his world, as it were, which we call Middle Earth. What he called Middle Earth, and I'll explain that too. There's all these little addendums, right? Little digressions. Middle Earth is essentially the world that is, and I think one of the things that people need to realize when we come to the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien is not creating like a separate cosmos, the way C.S. Lewis creates Narnia. So if you're familiar with the Narnia Chronicles, Lewis created a separate world, a separate cosmos. Aslan is Jesus incarnating in a different cosmos. That's how Lewis framed that. So when the Pevensey children in A Lion in Which the Wardrobe, when they pass through the wardrobe into Narnia, they're actually passing into a different cosmos, not just a different world, a different planet, but a different cosmos. That's sort of Lewis's mind. Tolkien actually created his Middle Earth to be the world that actually is. And let me just, I got a quote here where he says that. Let's see. Yeah, he talks about, the book is about the world that God created, the actual world of this planet. So in Tolkien's Middle Earth, in his stories, the fall is actually in the history, and it's affecting Middle Earth. So Adam and Eve, the temptation in the Garden of Eden, it's not mentioned, but it certainly is influencing. The need for redemption is influencing Middle Earth, influencing the story. Redemption is still yet to come in Tolkien's stories. It still is yet to come. And the story is taking place kind of in this middle ground, this sort of mythic middle ground, before Abraham, but after Noah. Basically, it's this kind of, or even might be before Noah too, I can't recall. But it's kind of this nebulous area. And it's intended to be mythical. So Tolkien didn't actually believe that these things would occur, but it hints at, if there was a myth from this biblical timeline, this biblical window here, what would that look like? And so because Tolkien is writing about the world that actually is, I mentioned this really about true truth and true myth and reality. This is where he can ground it powerfully in biblical truths, and where providence has a hand. So if you read The Lord of the Rings carefully, you can see the hand of providence at work throughout the text. And as a Christian reading it, I mean, again, people of all walks of life love The Lord of the Rings. It's not just a niche group of Christians who really appreciate this text. It's almost universal. There's people all over the world, in every nation, every age group, every culture group, who are fascinated by Lord of the Rings. But Christians in particular, I think, as we read The Lord of the Rings, there's a greater appreciation for seeing providence at work, seeing God's hand sort of working in these things. Let's see here. I want to go back to your question here, because I was getting kind of off there. So with that being said, to ignore his Christianity is to ignore him. I think, it goes to say for anyone, I mean, for you and for me, to sort of dismiss my Christian grounding, your Christian grounding. It's our identity. Our identity is in Christ. And so if you wipe that aside, you really don't have much to work with. And like I mentioned that his love for language, philology, is a bedrock of his storytelling. He did create languages and then cultures and stories around these languages. It's pretty complicated stuff, because he was a scholar in this field. He's an Oxford professor, and he's still recognized as an expert philologist. So if you were to study that field at university, you would study Tolkien's scholarly work. And you wouldn't necessarily study Lord of the Rings, but you look at his scholarly work and it still holds up. It's still relevant in that field. But I would argue, and I argue in the book that even his love for language is rooted in his Christian faith. God, who is the Word, who creates by the Word, who incarnates as the Word. There's Christianity is a faith of the book. We are people of the book, and it's no surprise at all that Tolkien, I think his Christianity informed even that aspect, that scholastic aspect of his life. And you think of in creation, one of the first tasks, or one of the early tasks that God gives Adam, is to name all the animals. And so there's God created humans in his image to be wordsmiths, to create names, to create language. And I think it's a profoundly interesting and relevant thing, and it's definitely connected to Tolkien's Christian worldview.
Go. Did you have something else to say?
Well, the second part of your question there was, or was that the next question? Hang on here. Make sure I'm not skipping ahead here. Is there anything more?
Yeah, just looking into really how his spirituality affected his wider work. So I think you touched on that quite well in your response, but feel free to elaborate if need be.
Yeah, I guess in terms of how his spirituality affected his writing, I mentioned again this idea that he points to reality, to that clarity. Not that Christians are necessarily, the smartest people in the world. In fact, sometimes there's a lot more intelligent atheists out there, and the Lord has seen fit to save, humble and seemingly foolish people, and yet there is a clarity that knowing God, knowing the Creator, brings to Christians. We see things clearly, and that clarity to see reality, but also the Lord of the Rings points to eternal realities as well. One of the main themes is death. Tolkien explores death in all of his writing. Almost everything that he writes, there's a major thread on death, and he approaches death from a very explicitly Christian perspective. His understanding of good and evil, his understanding of the grand scheme of history. Some would say that and I've read other scholars on this, secular scholars, who talk about the fact that, Tolkien was depressed because he talked about this long defeat. He said that the history of the world is a long defeat heading towards a miraculous, what he called a eucatastrophe, a good catastrophe, a final turning around, which is, depending on your eschatology, whether you're pre-mill or post-mill or all-mill, different people, different approaches. But there is this idea that there will be a final day where all things will be made right, where it's a happy ending. That history is a happy ending, but it's happy at the end. Whether, again, if you're post-mill, there's a bit of happiness ahead of time, but whatever the case is, there's this very Christian view of the long story, and the hope that Tolkien has comes through powerfully. Hope is also a major theme in the text, and it's a decidedly Christian hope. And joy, it's a decidedly Christian joy. And if your listeners are Christians, and I hope many of them are, they'll know exactly what I mean by that uniquely Christian joy, that uniquely Christian hope. It's not a wishful thinking. It's not a blind optimism. It's a grounded hope in the perfect plan of God, the perfect ending of history with the return of Christ, and all things will be made right, all tears will be wiped away. This beautiful story that comes, and I think that's why people like it too, because if you're not a Christian, you're reading this book, and it awakens this desire, this longing for God, this longing for God to come and to make all things right. I recently heard, it was just a soundbite or a video clip somewhere on social media. It was Al Mohler, president of Southern, was being asked a question. And it was a boy, I think a 10-year-old or 11-year-old boy, said, Mr. Mohler, what do you like better, the Narnia Chronicles or the Lord of the Rings? And it was a great question. And I was surprised by Muller's response. He said that he preferred the Lord of the Rings. So even though, Tolkien's coming from, he's a Roman Catholic, and Lewis, of course, was an Anglican Protestant. Muller said that he says it may be that there's more Protestantism in Tolkien than in Lewis. So because he felt that Tolkien, and he's right, Tolkien does follow the biblical timeline, the biblical storyline, a lot more closely than C.S. Lewis does. So it was a cool thing. And of course, there are other Christian leaders. Philip Ryken, he's the president at Wheaton College, is a major Lord of the Rings fan. Timothy Keller is another figure, former pastor of Redeemer in New York. He was also a big Lord of the Rings fan. And there are others, other Christians who have greatly valued, Protestant Christians who've greatly valued the Lord of the Rings because of this powerful perspective, this biblical worldview that comes through. And, one of the things I would recommend to your readers, or your listeners, eventually, if they first read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, of course, next read my book. And then of course there are other books I can talk about at the end there that he wrote. But one of the things that I would highly recommend if you're really getting into Tolkien is to read his collected letters. They recently released just this year. In fact, I haven't got it yet. It's coming out here in Canada. It's coming out in a couple of weeks. I wish I would have had it ahead of time. Because they're including additional letters. So I have an old one that came out in I think in 1983 or in the early 80s, the collection of his letters, but it didn't include all of his letters. There's a lot more unpublished stuff with Tolkien, but the additional letters, from what I understand, in this new edition that just came out, further points to Tolkien's faith. So stuff was actually cut out because it's too Christian. I don't know, but they've included it now. And in these letters, he talks to his sons. He writes letters to different people who basically pointing to the fact that the Lord of the Rings is fundamentally a Christian book. That's what he says. It's fundamentally a Christian or Catholic book. He says it's consonant with Christian thought and belief. He talks about being made in God's image as a sub-creator. As he creates, he's reflecting what he says, the supreme artist, the author of reality, which is, of course, God himself. So this Christianity comes through. And I should say here that, I get some pushback from non-Christians in the Tolkien world, because I think when I say it's a fundamentally Christian work, or even with Tolkien saying that's fundamentally a Christian work, they think that I'm suggesting that Gandalf is Jesus, or that, if you know these characters, Aragorn is Jesus. And of course, the truth is that Tolkien didn't believe that Gandalf wasn't Jesus. Samwise, he's not Jesus. Frodo's not Jesus. Aragorn's not Jesus. The way Aslan is, for example, in the Narnia Chronicles. And I think we have to help readers and listeners distinguish between what we mean by Christian. And so characters like Gandalf, characters like Aragorn, Samwise, Frodo, there are others who are Christ-like. So they have the qualities of Christ. The way, David is, in some ways, from the Old Testament, is Christ-like. Moses is Christ-like. And so on, these biblical characters that are not Christ, but they, through their characteristics, point to Christ. And I think that's why Lord of the Rings is so powerful, because the characters ultimately point to Christ. And I'm hesitant to spoil the ending of Lord of the Rings, so I've got to find a way. Well, sorry, Austin. I know, but this is crucial. I'll try to be as vague as possible. But in the story, they have this ring of power, which is an evil ring, and they have to destroy it. They have to destroy this evil ring. And so the main characters, the Fellowship, are sent on this quest to go all the way to the enemy territory, scale this giant mountainous volcano called Mount Doom, and toss this ring into the molten lava from whence it came. And that's the quest. And what's interesting is, and I'll leave it as vague as possible, but the quest essentially fails. Although it is a happy ending, so take heart, but it's not a complete happy ending. Evil isn't entirely vanquished. The main character fails to redeem Middle Earth. The main character fails to actually achieve full redemption. And of course, that's exactly what Tolkien believed as a Christian, that, Frodo, Gandalf, Aragorn, none of these figures can save humanity. There is only one Messiah in Middle Earth, and that is, of course, Jesus. And that comes clear by this sort of failed ending, that, which is another biblical narrative, right? If you follow the biblical narrative, if you read about, from day one after the fall, when, Eve is promised this seed, and then she gets pregnant with Cain. She's like, this is the one. Cain's the one who's gonna crush the serpent's head, and of course Cain doesn't. Cain smashes in his brother's head, and commits the first murder and fratricide in the world. And then, other subsequent individuals, Noah, we think, he's the guy who's going to save the world, and, Abraham. And right now I'm doing a Bible plan, and I'm reading about Jacob, and he's just, Jacob's family, and it's just a mess, and then of course you keep following the biblical narrative, and these heroes keep appearing. And then they're not heroes. They fail. And then we get to Jesus. And so Tolkien incorporates that. He's got these great heroes in his stories, but they all fail because, as I said, Tolkien was looking ahead to the Messiah yet to come. And that, of course, is Jesus, who's going to be the true savior of the world. And I should add, there's a couple more things I just want to say here, which might be of interest to hopefully all of your listeners. But Tolkien also secretly embedded some other more overtly Christian elements in his book. One of them is, and again, I'm sorry, Austin, you're not super familiar with the story just yet, but those who've read the books or seen the films, Dewey, I know you said you actually watched the films. Is that right? Yeah. So when Frodo and the Fellowship, when they set out from Rivendell, on their quest, that's when they're set out on their quest. There's a date. Tolkien gives the actual date. He's created a sort of a Middle Earth calendar, or a sort of Hobbit calendar, and the actual date is where is it here? When he sets out from Rivendell is December 25th, which of course in Christian tradition, in the Christian calendar, December 25th is the traditional birth date of Jesus. So they set out on this quest sort of as an advent, sort of as, the coming of the hero has come, and almost suggesting, is Frodo going to be the one that the prophecy to Eve is about, kind of hinting at that. And then as he goes through the adventure, when the ring is destroyed, and I won't say how or why or who does it, not to spoil that part of the storyline, but the date is actually March 25th. March 25th is has two significant meanings in the old ancient church calendar, but the key one is, of course, the crucifixion of Christ. So Tolkien, in this very subtle way, uses the church calendar to try to show some parallels, and those who are very, reading carefully and paying attention will, in fact, say, "Oh, okay, I see what Tolkien's doing. He's pointing beyond the Lord of the Rings. He's pointing to Christ. He's pointing to the greater story, the greater narrative, as it were." So.
That's great. Yeah. This has been already very helpful for me, something that I've wanted to learn more about. I know very many people are interested in the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, Tolkien, and I'm here to learn today, and we have a good person to learn from. So thank you.
Austin,
All right.
will you be binge watching The Lord of the Rings over the weekend, perhaps, after this conversation?
Yeah. At some point, I'm going to have to inform myself to some greater measure. But perhaps now I can be greater informed by asking our brother Jeremy about some of the early influences in Tolkien's life that shaped him to have such an imaginative mind. I think you addressed this subject in your book as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Certainly his so Tolkien had a very tragic life as a young person. He was born in South Africa, just the turn of the last century, so 1890 something. And he's born in South Africa because his father was a banker, a British banker, an English banker, working for the Bank of Africa, sort of on assignment down there. And his wife, or his mother, um, is also from England. So Tolkien was born in South Africa, but and there's some great adventures. I talk about his time as a young child growing up in this sort of very unusual landscape. But it was also a volatile time, and Tolkien's mother brought Mabel is her name, brought him and his brother Hilary back home to England to visit the grandparents, to meet family they hadn't met. And while away from home, from South Africa, Tolkien's father got sick and died, and so he was unable to see his father again. And that sense of being cut off from his father, going on this long, several thousand kilometer journey from South Africa back to Birmingham, being separated from his father, and then losing him altogether, had a devastating effect on J.R.R. Tolkien. And then a number of years later, his mother, she did convert to Roman Catholicism, and it cost her dearly. She was ostracized by family. People had cut her off. She was a widow. She had limited resources to support her family. And again, for us as Protestants, we look at that, we think, oh, what a shame that she got caught up with Catholicism. But the alternative at the time, some of the prevailing religions, denominations in England, Anglicanism was a big factor. And in many cases, there were many Anglican churches that were fairly empty and dead. And what drew Mabel to Catholicism was she got connected at it's called the Oratory. It's this place in Birmingham where it was founded by John Newman, Cardinal Newman. If you're familiar with Newman's work, his writings, founded by him, and it was a mission that was designed to help new converts, so adult converts to Christianity, to help them particularly with things like alcoholism and that sort of thing. And at this particular place, there seemed to be a vibrant Christian community. There seemed to be a genuine, vibrant community going on at this place, and I think that drew Mabel in. There was one particular priest. There were other ministers there who really took to heart James' call of pure religion, taking care of widows and orphans. And so they kind of took Mabel and the two boys under their wing and cared for them. And so Mabel, the mother, she converted to Christianity, converted to Catholicism. And even though it cost her dearly, she was cut off by her family and friends. And I think that greatly influenced Tolkien. It drew him to that, and I would say that his mother was instrumental in sort of instilling in him spiritual values, instilling in him a love for God, a love for the Word, a love for Christ. And again, as misguided as Roman Catholicism is, and by the way, in the back of my book, I wrote a little appendix where I flesh out what I mean by Roman Catholicism, what I mean by Christianity. I've got some colleagues who are Roman Catholic, and they sometimes think, why are you separating Christianity and Catholicism? So I unpack that. I explain what I mean by, Christian and Catholic. And so most of my book, I deal with this idea of mere Christianity, sort of borrowing from Baxter, borrowing from C.S. Lewis, this idea of what are the fundamentals, what are the essentials? We're not saved by, I'm going to say this very carefully in air quotes here, but we're not saved by right theology, if you know what I mean by that. It's faith in Christ. There's a justification through faith in Christ, not through getting all our theological ducks in a row. Although, and again, I say that in air quotes because we know how powerful right theology is, and we ought to constantly seek, because good theology is just knowing God better, and understanding how he acts and how he behaves in the world and how we need to respond to God. I mean, that's what right theology is. It's practical, it's beautiful, and it's true. Even I quote R.C. Sproul, who talks about that as well, the idea that there are Christians within Catholicism, even though theologically the church itself still rejects some crucial key biblical doctrines. So anyways, with that being said, so Mabel, what was, I think, a key factor. Tragically, she also dies. She had diabetes, and at the time, diabetes had no cure. There was no insulin, hadn't been invented yet. So she died quite suddenly as well. So Tolkien by this point was about 12 years old when his mother died. So father died, mother died, and it was just him and his brother. And so one of the ministers at the oratory, a guy named Francis, took the boys under his wing and took care of them and mentored to him. And Tolkien, throughout his life, spoke very highly about Francis, saying that he was like a second father. He was very dear to them and mentored them, and was also a spiritual mentor and advisor to Tolkien. Later on, I think you've got a question about this later, but later on, as an adult, Tolkien in rubbing shoulders with C.S. Lewis. In fact, Tolkien is instrumental in Lewis's conversion. Some of your listeners might be familiar with that. How Tolkien and another fella and C.S. Lewis went on a late night walk in Oxford and helped C.S. Lewis come from an atheist to a theist to eventually to a Christian. And so it's interesting that those two, who became great friends, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, great friends. I think it was iron sharpening iron. I think they helped feed and fuel and mentor their Christianity from there. But Tolkien talks about his own conversion under his mother's mentorship around, I think, the age of 9 or 10, somewhere in there, 11 years old. He came to Christ and continued with a few moments. I read about this in the book as well. There are times where he kind of falls away a bit and gets distracted by the cares of the world. But most of his life is solidly devoted to Christ, solidly devoted to his faith.
Well, Jeremy, you're on a confessionally Reformed Baptist podcast today, so it's only natural that we love the good use of alliteration. And it just so happens that you do have a section of this book titled Scholar, Soldier, and Scribe. Maybe you can take some time to explain why you chose this alliteration to describe Tolkien. And by the way, that is such a powerful little title there. I mean, that sounds like it's thoroughly embedded into some Pauline language, particularly thinking about the idea of soldier, thinking about the Christian life as a soldier. So we'll really be interested to hear you flesh that out.
Okay, well, alliteration. Wow. I always appreciate the application of alliteration. I'll say that. But if I could talk about this, it's sort of a nod to Tolkien himself. As a philologist, as a professor of English, his expertise was actually Anglo-Saxon. That was his area of interest, his area of expertise. And one of the key features of Anglo-Saxon poetry is, in fact, alliteration. So it's a major thing. But also as a Christian, it's many sermons I've preached where I use alliteration to sort of organize the thoughts and the points. But beyond that, there is definitely multiple layers of allusions here. That particular section does deal with the fact that J.R.R. Tolkien was an actual soldier. He fought in the First World War. He was an officer. I think he was a lieutenant. That's how the British pronounce that, and the Canadians too, lieutenant instead of lieutenant. The American pronunciation makes a lot more sense than this British Canadian one. But lieutenant, I think he was a lieutenant, was his rank as a non-commissioned officer. And he actually served in the bloodiest battle, for at least from the British perspective, and it could be the bloodiest battle, one of the bloodiest battles in World War I, the Battle of the Somme. It was just horrific, the number of deaths that occurred in that particular battle, and it's astonishing that Tolkien himself survived that battle, because tens of thousands of British youth were slaughtered and mowed down in that particular battle. So that's the first part, is that Tolkien was in fact a soldier. And he was also, at the time, he was just wrapping up, before he enlisted to serve in World War I. He was wrapping up his degree at Oxford University. So he studied there as well, his degree in English, philology, focusing on philology. And then, of course, scribe is the fact that, again, I'm alluding to the fact of this, in a biblical sense, a scribe is a teacher of the law, a teacher of religion. And again, we think of the scribes and the Pharisees almost in a negative light, but the idea of writing and capturing history, biblical theology as a writer. So I was kind of thinking all these elements here, as a scholar, as a soldier, as a scribe, the different things that shape Tolkien's writing down the road. There is a scholastic element to Tolkien's writing. Fortunately, it isn't distracting. You could read The Lord of the Rings and not catch the depth of his consistency. And let me give you some examples. The actual writing of Lord of the Rings took, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 years. So it took him a long time. So my 3 years is nothing compared to the Lord of the Rings. But in that process, as a scholar, I mentioned earlier that Tolkien invented all these languages, and they're consistent. So he's consistent in the use of languages, terms, and so on. Consistent grammar, consistent construction of various languages. So there is Elvish language embedded there that most readers just kind of gloss over. But some of the hardcore Tolkien fans who can actually speak Elvish, they follow this scholastic element. Other things like, the story covers a number of characters who are doing different things at different times, and Tolkien was very, very concerned about ensuring that the weather, if there's a story happening here and he goes back and retells the story, that the weather's consistent somewhere else in Middle Earth, or the cycle of the moon is consistent. So there is this scholastic element to Tolkien's writing, and that certainly appeals to us. This idea that, as Christians, we ought to be, I was mentioning earlier about theology. I think there is a scholastic element to the Christian life, and I think as Christians we ought to be sure of what we believe and be able to be prepared to give a defense for what we believe. And so there is that element there. The soldier element, of course, you're capturing that sense of it's a battle, that we're in this war as Christians. So again, Tolkien literally was a soldier, but there's also a spiritual battle underway. And then, of course, the scribe, the fact that we're called to tell the story, tell God's story to the world. And that's kind of what Tolkien's doing in writing The Lord of the Rings. He's contributing to and pointing to this great story, the true story of Christ, of redemption, and that hope in him. So so that's what's behind that section there. I don't know if you're hoping for something more exciting, but certainly I'm a huge fan of alliteration. Throughout the book, I use it probably too much, but Chance, my publisher, didn't mind too much. So
You can't ever have enough alliteration, in my opinion, brother. I'm a huge fan. Use it in my sermons. Try to use it in writing when necessary. So keep up the great alliterated work in your respective preaching and writing endeavors.
Thanks.
Always appreciating alliteration, as our brother said. Moving our conversation on now, I know I asked you in my last question who were some people that influenced his imaginative mind, but now opening it up more broadly, who were just some other people in his life that influenced him?
Yeah. I guess there's more. I mean, I talked about his mother quite a bit there, about in terms of spiritual influence. She was a brilliant mind herself. A great mind, just because of her circumstances, limited. But she did homeschool Tolkien and Tolkien's brother Hilary. Taught them Latin and Greek, and just amazing foundation. She exposed her kids to great works of literature, and in fact, eventually Mabel felt that she was unable to teach Tolkien. He was just so bright that he needed to go to a better school, and he did wind up at the time, a remarkable sort of private school or independent school in the UK in a place called Birmingham. And through that school experience, he encountered some good Christian teachers who instilled in Protestant Christian teachers who instilled in him a love for language, but a love for God. In fact, a special course that Tolkien, because he was so bright, he was able to take was a sort of advanced course in Koineo Greek. So Tolkien, as a young boy, was studying the Greek New Testament with a Greek New Testament teacher, and sort of getting into the language, looking at how the words of Christ, the words of the Apostle Paul in the original languages. It's remarkable. But beyond that, Tolkien was also influenced by some of his reading. One of his chief influences was another great Christian and Catholic writer, G.K. Chesterton. Just a great mind, a great light, hugely influenced Tolkien's thinking. Another guy, George MacDonald. Again, these are obviously, I mean, they're controversial figures in some ways, but I think there's much we can learn from these figures. And George MacDonald, there's a lot of his theology that I disagree with significantly, but he also wrote from a very profoundly Christian worldview, and his writings, particularly his fantasy writings. Some of your listeners might be familiar with the Princess and the Goblin and the Curdie stories. Does that ring a bell? Do you guys know those stories at all? No, never heard of it. Okay, it's good. No, okay. Forget though. Go right to Lord of the Rings. Don't worry about George MacDonald. But he's another guy who had a big influence on Tolkien in terms of looking at how you interpret or how you bring a Christian worldview into your stories. That's what George MacDonald did. Is he brought a Christian worldview in. Tolkien also had some friends. One of his best friends at the school was another Christian believer, Protestant guy, very, very, very solid fella. Tolkien and this other young man, they would debate religion, they would debate faith, they would debate the Bible, and I think that helped expose Tolkien to some more Protestant thinking, some more biblical thinking about the world. So he's not your typical Catholic. I think he because he's been surrounded by so many Protestants, and then later in life, when he becomes a professor at Oxford, that's when he meets C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist at first. Lewis was born and raised in Northern Ireland. He's an Ulsterman, but he also experienced the loss of his mother. His mother died when he was about 9 years old. This is C.S. Lewis, and eventually Lewis it pulled him away from his upbringing. He kind of rejected Christianity altogether, and he had a very brilliant atheist tutor. This is C.S. Lewis, a guy named I forget his name, but through this brilliant mind, sort of solidified in Lewis's mind that Christianity's bunk. I'm an atheist, and so Lewis arrived at Oxford. He was a don there, sort of a. I'm not exactly sure the entire hierarchy of professorship at Oxford University, but Tolkien was a full-on professor, and Lewis was something like not really, something more than an adjunct, if you can kind of follow me on that. It's called a don. So he was a teacher, but not a full-on professor. And they became friends. Lewis and Tolkien became friends, and then eventually, as I mentioned, Tolkien helped lead Lewis to Christ, which is astonishing because Lewis went on to become such a powerful apologist. Now, obviously, Lewis's theology isn't right on a number of fields either, but he certainly is a powerful Christian writer and has a powerful influence on all sorts of saints around the world. And I've been tremendously blessed by Lewis's writing. But I think C.S. Lewis also brought to bear tremendous influence on J.R.R. Tolkien, because Lewis remained a Protestant. He remained an Anglican. There's some controversy there, but I would argue that he remained a solid Protestant Anglican throughout his life. And I think as Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings, Lewis continued to feed and prompt and encourage and support Tolkien. They would meet a couple times a week at various pubs, and as Tolkien would write portions of the story, he would read these to this group called the Inklings, of which C.S. Lewis was a part, and they would get feedback. And later on, Tolkien admits that if it wasn't for C.S. Lewis, he wouldn't have finished the book. He wouldn't even written the book. So I think there's a powerful influence that Lewis had, not only in writing and being creative, but also in continuing that sort of more Protestant, more biblical perspective. I would also say, in terms of continuing influence, Tolkien eventually marries his wife Edith, who he was madly in love with and grew in love and appreciate across their long marriage. They had a lovely brood of children. I think she also had an impact. She was a more simple person. She wasn't a profound academic, but she loved gardening. She loved simple things, and I think she also would have a big impact on her husband in appreciating simpler things. And again, if you know The Lord of the Rings, you've seen the film, and eventually, Austin, when you read the book, you'll see that the hobbits are particularly delightful characters because they love simple things, simple pleasures. And I think he learned that from his wife, who was just down to earth. And of course, Samwise is the great hero of the book, and he's the simplest of them all. He's a gardener who just cooks and gardens, and there is an element there. Samwise is my favorite character. He's the greatest character, I think, in the book. And Tolkien himself had great affection. He considered Samwise to be the true hero of the book. And I would say that out of all the characters, Samwise is probably most like Edith. So in a way, he kind of embodied his wife in this particularly noble but simple life character.
Very well said, Jeremy. And when we consider Tolkien's work as a whole, we've already considered, of course, a few prominent works that he produced over the course of his writing career. But just for the sake of our listeners who are seeking to become better familiar with Tolkien, what are some other important literary works that you haven't mentioned yet, or any specific literary works that you think give us greater insight into the man that Tolkien was. Again, you've already hit on several, but if there were any additional ones that you wanted to mention, I'm sure listeners would be appreciative. I know that Austin and me both, as novice Tolkien admirers, we would definitely be edified as well with any insights that you could share.
Sure. Well, like I said, there's a ton out there. It's hard to know where to start. I would say, if you're just coming to Tolkien, I would start with The Hobbit. It is a children's book, so just be aware of that. He wrote it for children. And his own children really appreciated the book when he was writing it and telling them the story. And but certainly adults can enjoy it. The Hobbit is a book that I return to constantly, and am blessed and encouraged, and it's so enjoyable. And you can see the hints of this increasingly developed and sophisticated mind unfold. The Lord of the Rings is a sequel to The Hobbit, but it morphed into this massive tale. I mean, The Hobbit was very successful when it came out. Immediately people were comparing it to classics like The Wind in the Willows. If you're familiar with that, it's a British story, children's story, to Alice in Wonderland, but it surpassed them all. In fact, The Hobbit is better known than those other classic books. And it certainly is great. It's a great story that can be enjoyed at any age. Then, of course, The Lord of the Rings, as I said, it was a sequel. Because of that success of The Hobbit, the publisher said to Tolkien, look, you got to get a sequel out. Write a sequel. So Tolkien said, sure, I'll get started writing the sequel. And then 15 years later, this massive, 1,000-page tome comes out, and Tolkien's publishers were like, what, this isn't a children's book. This isn't what we're looking for. But of course, it became one of the most successful novels of the 20th century. And I can't overstate that. There's been all sorts of studies done, different surveys and this and that. And there's a number of them. The more famous one was done by the Folio Society in the UK, where they surveyed all these people, and they said, out of all the books in the English language, what's the greatest novel? And people are thinking of some book by Charles Dickens, maybe Jane Austen, maybe D.H. Lawrence, or some of these great scholastic texts, and then it comes out decidedly The Lord of the Rings is considered the greatest novel of the English language, beating out great novelists like Dickens and like Jane Austen. And people are scratching their heads. They're like, how can this book about dragons and elves and dwarves be considered the greatest novel of the 20th century, the greatest novel of the English language? But it truly is remarkable. And I think it's sold millions and millions and millions of copies around the world in dozens and dozens of languages. So definitely The Hobbit, definitely The Lord of the Rings are top of the list. In terms of this one here is a little more complex. The Silmarillion, I know this is a podcast, but you can see on the screen here. The Silmarillion is Tolkien's sort of magnum opus. This is his work that he spent most of his life working on. He started drafting out versions of this back when he was in World War I. So, 1914, he started working on this story, this great mythic tale. And it was published by his son, Christopher Tolkien, sort of took up the torch and took all of his father's notes and compiled it into the Silmarillion. But it's also profoundly Christian work. It's about creation. It's about the fall, but through this sort of mythical lens that he creates. It's very edifying, but it's hard to read. It's very dense because it's not written in the same delightful narrative style that The Lord of the Rings is. It's almost like you're reading a summary of a myth, and you almost feel when you read the Silmarillion, there's just jam-packed full of stories in there that you wish, if I could use that word, that Tolkien had written full-on Lord of the Rings length novels for each of these little snippets. But if you are going to tackle the Silmarillion, I recommend that you listen to a podcast. I know I shouldn't advertise another podcast on this podcast, but two guys, they're just Tolkien fans, called the Prancing Pony podcast, and they take an episode per chapter. and they talk you through it. Although it goes for about an hour and a half each chapter that they talk about, but it's so helpful. They're so knowledgeable. One of the guys there, I don't know all the details, but I'm pretty sure he's a believer, listening to the way he talks. But it's not overtly a Christian podcast, but they're great two guys. I forget their names. Mark's something and Alan Sisto, they're great, and they just help you understand the Silmarillion. If you want to understand Tolkien as a scholar, and how he brings his Christian view, his Christian worldview, and scholarship together, he wrote a number of essays, profound essays. He was instrumental in bringing Beowulf back and drawing out a sort of a Christian worldview in Beowulf, which is the first known literary work in the English language. It goes back about 1,000 years when it was written in Anglo-Saxon, but written by a Christian monk. So Beowulf, of course, he talks a lot about Christianity as a scholar, but I highly recommend his essay, which can be found in all sorts of compilations of his writing. It's called On Fairy Stories. And in there, Tolkien gives his sort of seminal explanation or key explanation of what fairy stories or fantasy literature is all about and the value it can bring to us as humans. But then he also brings in a profoundly Christian understanding of the creative process and why using our imagination is necessary as Christians. So he brings in this powerful text. It's an essay that, as I mentioned, is still read in the realm of, if you're studying formally fairy stories or Grimm's fairy tales, all these kind of things, you're going to read Tolkien's essay here. But as a Christian, it's very enlightening because he talks openly and freely about how how as Christians or as human beings we're made in the image of God, and we don't make stuff up. We don't create ex nihilo. God creates ex nihilo. We as sub-creators, he calls it, create using the stuff that God made. Right. So we build and we create and we shape using God's raw material that he's given us, which is a very biblical view of creativity. To get a sense of Tolkien as a father, he did write a bunch of other children's books beyond The Hobbit, but one of the best is this. It's called J.R.R. Tolkien Letters from Father Christmas. He started writing these very delightful letters to his children from Father Christmas or Santa Claus. I know I'm getting quite controversial here, talking about Santa Claus now on a Reformed podcast, but he what you see in there is he tells these great little funny stories about the North Pole and so on and so forth, but they're not silly. They're not silly stories like some of these Christmas specials that you see on TV, Rudolph and things like that. There's a real delight that he has in his own children and a great sense of humor. And so if you want to get a sense of a father who truly loves his kids, a father who wants to entertain his kids but still teach them good lessons, that collection, Letters from Father Christmas, they were written not to be published. He wrote them literally to letters to his own kids. I think there's about 20 years of letters that he wrote each year. But it was, again, after his death, one of his, I think his daughter-in-law, she compiled them and published them as Letters from Father Christmas. One more story. There's lots more I can recommend, but if you're looking for a non-Middle Earth, so something that's not really about the specific world of hobbits and dwarves and elves, he wrote a very short story called Farmer Giles of Ham. It's a very funny, very delightful story about this humble farmer who goes on an adventure to slay a dragon. And again, it's also very, very rich in biblical and Christian values. Christian ideas come through very powerfully. And in my book, I sort of do a bit of a digressive analysis of some of those Christian allusions and how Tolkien's drawing on his worldview to present this great story. And it's a great story in of itself. I read it to my own kids, and we just howled. It was so funny and so much, such a great story, and with these great biblical ideas embedded there, coming through so beautifully and so powerfully.
Thank you for this, brother, and thank you for your time to have this conversation about Tolkien. We'll make sure that we link in this episode to your book. Very informative episode for me. I know that I personally am not immediately drawn toward allegory, but I have been provoked to put some effort in after this conversation that you've had with me. But I'll give you the opportunity to wrap up our show with any final thoughts that you might have about your book, Tolkien, any of his literature, any final thoughts or encouragements that you'd like to leave to our listeners.
Yeah, I think just reading a story that is grounded in a Christian biblical worldview without being explicitly or in your face, the way other sometimes C.S. Lewis is almost over the top in trying to push the Christian agenda. In fact, Tolkien was critical of C.S. Lewis about how almost pushy he was with some of these things. And you mentioned allegory. It's not an allegory. In fact, it's not like John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress at all, which is about a entirely symbolic world. Although I love Pilgrim's Progress. I think it's been an edifying read for me over the years. But it can be a bit too obvious, too pushy as well. But there's a subtlety, a nuanced subtlety. What I mentioned at the beginning about reality, it's true to life. And there are times where I'm facing difficult times, or I'm trying to struggles and this and that, where I'm encouraged by the example of the characters in The Lord of the Rings as they persevere, as they cling to a greater hope, as we see providence at work. So I encourage all of your listeners and you two guys to pick up and read Tola Lege. Pick up and read not only the Word of God, but which is wonderful and paramount, but the Lord of the Rings. You will not be disappointed. It is a tough slog. You do have to hang in there and persevere, and but boy, it's rewarding. As I said, I return to the Lord of the Rings every 2 years, and every time I finish reading it, I'm ready to go again. I do force myself to wait at least 2 years, but I just finished it recently, reading to my daughters the Lord of the Rings, and soon as I finished, I was like, I'm ready to go back and start again. But there are other things that I ought to read as well. So so I encourage you all to sort of take it on. It's definitely worth it. You will not be disappointed. Your faith will be encouraged, and you'll be the wiser and the better for it.
Very well said, brother. It's been a delight getting to talk with you about your latest book and about the life of Tolkien. We pray that the Lord will continue to richly bless your writing ministry for years to come. We hope our listeners as well will take the opportunity to explore this great author for their own benefit and just for their own enjoyment, to enjoy the fruit of Tolkien's writing corpus. So, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us today, my friend.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for letting me talk about one of my favorite authors.
Absolutely. To our listeners, we want to thank you as well for your continued support of the Covenant Podcast. And until next time, we wish you grace and peace. God bless.